Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our work session today, talking about real estate tax relief, and particularly here to listen to, thank the Real Estate Tax Relief Working Group that's been underway, or had been underway for quite a period of time, doing some work directed by the county board and our year ago budget decisions. So today is an opportunity to hear from the chair on behalf of the working group, Paul Holland, hearing about the group's, sort of reminding us what the group's charge was and the process they went through, and then their recommendations. Then we'll hear from the manager regarding the staff recommendations and thoughts. Having been part of it throughout, but sometimes there's a unanimous agreement within a working group, sometimes not, and then the staff have their crack at it and give us their thoughts as well. So we're gonna, I'm sure, have some questions for both the working group and for the staff by the time we get to the end of this. Bottom line is that it's an expensive place to live. And we know that part of our goal has always been in Arlington to ensure that nobody has to leave the county or leave their home solely because of the local tax, the real estate tax itself. That has always been a guiding principle. How we implement it, what those thresholds are, what those asset levels, how we compare to our neighboring jurisdictions is really a lot of the work that this was undertaken in this process. So we look forward to hearing from you. So Paul Holland, welcome, and if you'd like to introduce your group. Now it's on.
All right, it's on. Thank you, Chairman Passett and members of the board, for having us here today. We're excited to be here. We concluded a intense process and really appreciate the efforts of everyone who was on the working group, as well as the staff who supported that. We're joined by 6 members of the working group, and I'll just read their names in addition to myself. So Pam Jewell.
Paul, can you, I see people in the back going
Yep.
like this. Can you either pull it closer or speak up a little bit?
Sure. So Pam Jewell is here. Catherine Scruggs. Pat Findicolu. Prentice DeJesus. Carolyn Day. Bill Statterman and Jill Herndon were our group members who are here today, and we thank them for attending today. So with that, I will move on. We're going to start the presentation.
Okay.
So here's an overview. I'm going to speak to the first 5 topics through definitions, and then I'll turn it over to the staff to present the detailed part of what we accomplished. So moving on to the next slide, the working group was charged by the county manager to collaborate with the staff and work to develop recommendations and possible future changes to the real estate tax relief program. Based on the charge, we researched and reviewed the best practices related to real estate tax relief throughout the country and looked at other options within the Commonwealth of Virginia as well. We worked with the community and relevant stakeholders and engaged with them on a number of fronts to talk about this program and to learn more about it. We worked to determine if there may be Arlingtonians who qualify for real estate tax relief, but who are not currently participating in the program, and provide recommendations for what we could do differently to improve outreach to those folks and perhaps increase the number of participants in the county. We worked with a consultant. There was a consultant retained to conduct surveys and or focus groups, when we did both a survey and a focus group, to gauge the success of the program and talk and have conversations with people who are participating and people who could potentially participate in the future. We looked at the best practices and the results of those surveys to inform an analysis of the current program and really guide the research helped guide our discussions and deliberations throughout the working group process. And then we've come forward today, as you'll see, with a number of recommendations on how to, what we think is improve the program and to best structure it in the future. So I've introduced the members of the working group here today. We had 12 members representing the following organizations. We had a representative from the Commission on Aging, representative from the Disability Advisory Commission, representative from the Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission, representative from the Housing Commission. We had 4 participants from the Real Estate Tax Relief Program, and then 4 members at large. Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Weistat were our board liaisons, and I chaired the group along with Patricia Sullivan serving as the vice chair. She was our Commission on Aging representative. We were very well supported by the DHS staff and received additional assistance from CPHD and the Treasurer's Office. I think their staff are here today, Ms. Rucker and Mr. Lidke. So we appreciate all the support that we got from the staff throughout this process. The county contracted with Rheingold. We mentioned a survey, and they did the telephone survey and also focus groups with Arlington's older homeowners and potential participants. So with regard to community outreach, we had 11 working group meetings that were open to the public. We had a web page that we updated, or the staff updated regularly with the materials, including the meeting minutes and agendas and summaries and presentations. Any of the materials from the meetings were posted there. We had an email listserv that went out, social media, of course, the survey and focus groups that we talked about. There were media releases. We did a number of presentations to civic organizations, including the Committee of 100 and the key commissions who were represented on the tax relief program. We had mailings and then a community meeting, which was attended by about 80 folks at Arlington Mill Community Center. And so just a little bit of background on what the program is and where it was when we inherited this charge. Virginia localities are authorized to provide tax relief to homeowners age 65 or over, as well as permanently and totally disabled homeowners. The current program provides exemptions or some of all real estate taxes for qualified homeowners, and the income limit right now is $99,472, and household assets at or below $340,000. We have some tiers within this program, and homeowners can receive a full 50% or 25% exemption. Homeowners within the income guidelines who have assets over 340 but below 540 can defer in Arlington. And homeowners not qualifying for a full exemption can also defer what is not exempt. And homeowners approved for exemption and or deferral in calendar year 2016 had on average participated in the program for 8 years. And just a couple definitions so that we standardize what we're talking about. Exemption is defined as an elimination of obligation to pay for some or all of one's real estate taxes, and deferral is a postponement of paying for some or all of one's real estate taxes. And in Arlington County, that's deferred taxes are repaid without interest or penalty when property changes ownership. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the staff, and I believe Anita is going to present from here on.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to just especially send my appreciation to all the staff who supported us, as well as the working group members who really delved into this material and worked very hard to come up with a recommendation and a final report. So on the real estate tax relief, we're going to tell you where our current program stands. And this top table illustrates the levels of exemption that Paul explained. We have a full exemption, 50%, 25%, and then a deferral. And those are then adjusted according to the household size. So the first column presents the 1 to 2 person household size with annual income and asset limits, and the The far right column indicates what a three-person household annual income and asset limits would be. And you can see that as people's income goes up to 99,472 annually, they can receive an exemption up to 25% if their assets are still below $340,000, but once they pass the $340,000 and their income is 99,472, then they are eligible for a deferral. And similarly, those numbers change as a three-person household. And the reason we're pointing this out is because this is going to alter in the proposal that's being put forward today about household composition and their corresponding income and asset levels. So for those who need a little extra help to wrap their hands around what is an exemption and what is a deferral, we actually have a sort of sample hypothetical two-person household in that bottom chart. If a two-person household had an income of $55,000 and assets of $250,000, and their real estate tax bill was $10,000, well, 100% exemption would mean all of the $10,000 would be exempt. They would not have to pay real estate taxes. And then as your income varies and your assets vary, depending on the exemption level, whether it's 50% or 25%, then you would only be paying, 50% of the tax bill, and 50% of it would be exempt, or you would be able to defer the other $5,000 that remains. And similarly with the next example. So that's just to give you sort of an idea of how the program works. On slide 9, we have a little bit of history from calendar year 2011 to calendar year 2016. And these are calendar years because that's the cycle of our real estate tax relief program. It's a calendar year basis. And this indicates to you, along the different exemption levels, the households that were participating at each level, and the totals. And you can see, from 2011 to 2016, that indeed the participation did decline from 1150 to about 929, where we were last calendar year, which was one of the impetuses behind the working group to see how we could increase participation in the program. The revenue is basically uncollected. So it's not that this is an expenditure. We're not handing out funding. We're not collecting funding. So it's called foregone revenue. And we're about at $4.1 million of revenue that was not collected in calendar year 16. On slide 10, this is just a snapshot of this calendar year 2016 in terms of income levels and asset levels to show you how our households are distributed along that continuum. So we do feel, I think the working group still feels that indeed there are still a number of households, and the majority of the households are at the lower end of the assets and income level, but we do have a couple who are at the very higher ends of income and assets. Slide 11 demonstrates what the assessed value of the real estate tax relief homes are of those who participate from this past calendar year, and from a lower value of their home at around 200 or below thousand to over $1 million. We do have 7 households in that category. This is a heat map, or a map that shows you how the households are distributed across Arlington County. And you can see on this map that basically every zip code has somebody participating in this real estate tax relief program, from North Arlington all the way down to South Arlington. And so it's pretty well distributed geographically. And this is a very dense slide. I'm sorry if the public can't see this so well, but this shows in the first column where the Arlington County program, real estate tax relief program, currently stands next to the proposed program and our neighboring jurisdictions, starting with Fairfax County, City of Alexandria, Loudoun, and Prince William. And what we'll go into further detail about this in the following slides, but you can see that the proposed column, which is the second one, brings us closer to what our neighboring jurisdictions have in terms of condensing the levels of composition of the household to basically one level, adding on certain kinds of income exclusions, such as for relatives in the home who are non-owner, non-spouse, and for people with disability having an exemption for their income. But we'll get into that in a moment. So I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin Hutchinson.
Thank you. The working group, this slide just talks a little bit about how they arrived at their draft recommendations and then their final recommendations. In January, the working group prepared a set of 20 draft recommendations, which included about 30 accompanying action items. Then in February, those recommendations got wrapped into a draft program recommendations report that highlighted their recommendations on the structure and administration of the program. The draft report was posted online for public comment in mid-February, and DHS staff, along with the working group chair, met with various civic organizations and commissions mid-February through early March. We met with the Civic Federation, the Housing Commission, the Commission on Aging, Disability Advisory Commission, FAC, and the Committee of 100. A community meeting was then held at Arlington Mill Community Center on March 6th with about 80 people in attendance, and community feedback was received online, via email, via mail, and via hand delivery through March 10th. More than 260 comments were received and reviewed by staff in the working group. Then a final program recommendations report incorporating this public feedback was submitted to the county manager and the county board on April 10th. In all, there are 20 final recommendations from the working group with 33 accompanying action items. In this presentation, we've organized the recommendations around the anticipated time frame for the start of implementation, and we've also indicated in parentheses any changes that may be required in order to implement them. Phase 1 recommendations would be implemented in the next year or so, the first 12 months. First, the working group recommended to revise the application materials to be more user-friendly, so using more simple language, increasing the font size, developing supplementary materials. And they also are recommending to revise the real estate tax relief timeline to give participants additional time to apply. This would require a local code change, and it would change the deadline from mid-August to November 15th. The working group's also recommending to allow for retroactive relief of up to 2 years in certain circumstances if a physical or mental health issue or extreme circumstances beyond the applicant's control prevented their application to the program. This would also require a local code change. The group is recommending to increase outreach and technical assistance. The group actually came up with about 2 pages worth of organizations, groups, and businesses that they recommend we outreach to. And they also are recommending that we provide additional assistance with applications and appeals. They're recommending to utilize existing commissions or citizen groups to provide periodic program oversight. For example, the Commission on Aging has volunteered to be a part of that process. They're also recommending to enhance existing data and feedback collection efforts. Lastly, on this slide, they're recommending to investigate mortgage lenders' opposition to deferrals. That's something that came up in many conversations within the working group, and it's also been something that's been highlighted in the news across the country. Many lenders oppose deferrals because of the first lien rights that they actually give the county when the home is sold or foreclosed upon. And there's also some problems with the compatibility between reverse mortgages and deferrals, and statutorily that's not actually permitted. Next slide. The working group's phase 1 recommendations also include recommendations related to the asset limits. The working group is recommending to change the asset limits. Currently, they're $340,000 for exemptions and $540,000 for deferrals, as Anita explained. but the working group is recommending that these be changed to $400,000 for exemptions, and remain at $540,000 for deferrals. Both of these would be automatically adjusted based on changes in the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, or the CPIU. This would require a local code change. They're also recommending that the method for calculating assets be revised. They're recommending to only include the assets of owners and owner spouses, and they're recommending to allow for the deduction of approved liabilities if an applicant's asset total exceeds the asset limit. These liabilities would include medical and dental expenses not covered by insurance and as defined by the IRS Publication 502, and either reported on somebody's Schedule A or as substantiated through the submission of invoices and receipts. The other approved liability or debt would be the out-of-pocket emergency home repairs that are not covered by insurance, or the condominium association individual special assessments, each of which would occur within the tax year and exceed $1,000 per repair or assessment. So this table here actually shows a side-by-side of the current asset limits for both exemptions and deferrals and the proposed, and then also the different criteria, the adjustment for current and proposed, and the allowable deductions for current and proposed. Additionally, the working group is recommending that in phase one, the method for calculating applicants' income be changed. This would also require a local code change. They're recommending that all disability income for either owner and or spouse be excluded, and that up to $10,000 from the income of each non-owner, non-spouse relative living in the home be excluded as well. With this in mind, they're also recommending that the income limits and exemption levels be revised according to this table, with an automatic annual adjustment tied to the change in area median income. So as you can see in this table, currently we have varying income limits based on household size for 100% exemptions, 50% exemptions, and 25% exemptions. But they're actually recommending that all of those income limits be changed to be uniform regardless of household size within each exemption level. The working group is also recommending that a 75% exemption level be added. And as you can see in the bottom row, currently the deferrals are essentially determined by somebody's asset level. They can make up to $99,472 and still remain eligible for an exemption so long as their assets are below $340,000. But if their assets are over $340,000, they would then only be eligible for a deferral. The working group is actually recommending that that upper income limit, $80,001 to $99,472, only be eligible for a deferral, as long as their asset levels are below the $400,000. And then if their asset levels are over $400,000 but over $540,000, they would still be eligible for a deferral as well. This slide shows the impact of these recommended changes to the asset and income limits. The county manager recommendation, which we will discuss in a bit, is that all changes would be effective January 1st, 2019. This would enable us to have sufficient time to outreach to participants. Increasing the exemption asset limit from $340,000 to $400,000 per year would impact approximately 90 households, and that would result in a decrease of about $376,000 in revenue each year. We're uncertain about the impact on households and the fiscal impact for the deduction of medical, dental expenses, emergency home repairs, and condominium assessments, but we will certainly track that in the first couple of years of implementation. In terms of revising the income limits and establishing the additional exemption level of 75%, we're estimating that 90 households would lose their exemption as a result of decreasing the upper income limit for exemptions from $99,472 to $80,000, but they would still be eligible for the deferral if they so chose, and we estimate that approximately 1/3 or 30 of these households would choose to defer what was previously exempted. 145 households would move from a 100% exemption to a 75% exemption, and 25 households would move from a 50% exemption to a 25% exemption. The net impact on The net fiscal impact of all of those changes would be approximately a $320,609 increase in revenue each year. In terms of excluding disability income, 7 households would have disability income excluded, and we estimate that there would be a $20,000 decrease in revenue each year. At this point, we're uncertain of the number of households impacted or the fiscal impact of excluding the income, the first $10,000 in income from each non-owner, non-spouse relative in the home. But again, we would track that in the first couple of years of implementation. On slide 20, we move into the phase 2 recommendations. The working group is recommending to designate county revenue received from deferral repayments to support affordable housing opportunities with accessibility and supportive services for older residents and residents with disabilities. This would be a policy consideration that would require some additional investigating, but just for some context, over the last 6 years, the county has received an average of $113,383 in deferral repayments per year. And as of December 31st, 2016, there was approximately $3.6 million in outstanding deferrals. The working group is also recommending to build the application materials into the website and recommending to explore options to increase funding for the development of and services associated with housing for older residents and residents with disabilities. They're also recommending to provide homeowners with information about the home equity conversion mortgage, which is HUD's reverse mortgage product. And they're recommending to explore options to provide real estate tax deductions to owners of rental dwellings that provide reduced rent to older renters and renters with disabilities. This would require a local code change and likely a state code change as well. On slide 21, we get into the phase 3 recommendations, which are 3 to 5 years down the road. They're recommending to consider implementing additional programs that could provide financial relief to older residents and residents with disabilities. This is along the lines of personal property tax relief, refuse fee relief, those sort of things. A number of the surrounding jurisdictions offer those sort of programs, and the working group came across them in their research. Could potentially require a local code change depending on what came out of it. The working group's also recommending to conduct an extensive review and reevaluation of the program, which would be done by some of the existing commissions that we talked about earlier in the phase 1 recommendations. And the working group is recommending to advocate for the amendment of state code in order to provide Virginia homeowners with protection from lenders that refuse to recognize participation in deferral programs. This could require a local code change and a state code change as well, depending on what went forward. The working group is recommending to explore establishing separate real estate tax classes specifically for older homeowners and homeowners with disabilities in lieu of the real estate tax relief program. Could also require a local code or state code change. This was just something that the working group members also came across in their research and seemed appealing to consider down the road. And lastly, the working group is recommending to explore ways to enable older residents to age in the community in affordable, multi-age, multi-unit developments with accessibility and supportive services. This is something that's done in many jurisdictions across the country and could certainly be implemented in Arlington. On slide 22, we highlight 2 areas in which the working group had some pretty extensive discussions, but were not able to come to consensus and ultimately adopt a single recommendation. The first is home value. Currently, home value is not considered in the real estate tax relief program, but the working group did discuss several options. First of all, they discussed keeping the program as is and not limiting the amount of home value that is eligible for an exemption. And then they also they also discussed limiting the amount of home value that is eligible for exemption to the median assessed home value and allowing for the deferral of any remaining taxes not eligible for exemption. Lastly, they discussed limiting the amount of home value that is eligible for exemption to $800,000 unless the applicant purchased the home prior to January 1st, 2000, and then also allowing for the deferral of any remaining taxes not eligible for exemption. Second, they discussed the issue of program management. Currently, the real estate tax relief program is managed by the Department of Human Services with support from the Treasurer's Office. The working group discussed 3 possible recommendations, but again, the consensus could not be reached. They recommended retaining program administration within DHS. They discussed retaining program administration in DHS. They discussed moving the program administration to the Commissioner of the Revenue. And they also discussed the possibility of creating a system of joint administration so that the resources and skills of both DHS and the Commissioner of the Revenue could be used to support the program.
So this is our last slide, and just to wrap up, I know it's a very dense material, and we welcome conversation and questions. The county manager's recommendation to the board is to begin the implementation of Phase 1 recommendations, both the administrative programmatic ones, as well as the local code changes, with an estimated completion date by the end of 2018, and an effective date for the new code and administrative guidelines, January 1st, 2019. We do anticipate that there will be some expense related to it. Particularly, there's a projected net decrease in collected revenue or revenue that's foregone. We don't know that this is completely accurate at this time because we still have those unknown categories where deductions for spouses, for non-relative, non-spouse, non-owner relatives is not calculated. So roughly now we're calculating there'll be 120,000 of uncollected revenue, and would require additional FTE time amounting to 1 FTE due to the increasing complexity of the administrative requirements that are proposed. Thank you.
All right, okay. Thank you. Paul, do you have anything to add to this at the back end of the presentation?
I just want to, sure, I'm on. I just wanted to recognize the folks who are not here, who were on the working group.
Pull that up close.
Yeah, I just wanted to recognize the folks who were on the working group who were not able to attend. Edith Gravely was one of our at-large reps. Oh. Hi, Edith. Edith is here. And then Evelyn G. from Housing Commission, Patty Sullivan from Commission on Aging, who is our vice chair, and Peggy Jones, who is an at-large rep. So we are really grateful for all their work. You know, I've been involved in a number of county processes, and this is, I can say clearly, this is one of the best that I've been involved in, from the staff support, but also from the working group. So it was an honor and a pleasure to lead this group. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, as far as I can tell from the agenda, we're actually through A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3, right? So we are at the end of the presentation part. We've just heard a great summary, and I think you're right, it's a bit dense to get your arms around it. And even what you presented, you know some of the implications, but not all the implications are really known at this time. So why don't I open it up to my colleagues? You know, we could walk through the recommendations, but I think why don't we start this way, is try to just open it up to any of them in which you have particular questions or you want to have further dialogue or clarification. So who would like to go first? And maybe I'll turn to one of the liaisons from the board, Mr. Weistat, and then we'll go to Mr. Dorsey to see what he'd like to offer up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Holland and all the members of your working group. Thanks very much. You know, one thing that I was struck by is not only did you focus on the immediate task at hand of really delving into the minutia of our current program, but you also put forth a number of short-term and mid-term and long-term recommendations for helping Arlington become a more aging-friendly community. And that is a big bonus that I see coming out of the working group. Let me just ask a couple of questions, and I want to focus in particular about the deferral versus exemption dynamic, and also the value of a home in terms of whether or not we ought to consider making that an eligibility criteria as well. And I realize that there were a host of pros and cons and back and forth on those two dynamics. And so maybe we start the conversation by asking you if you might be able to characterize or draw draw a line around the conversation, both with respect to whether or not from an equitable and fiscal standpoint it might make sense to have some sort of cap on the value of a home, and what about the equities of deferral versus exemption?
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to that. So we had, with regard to the value of the home, we talked about a number of options, and there really wasn't a clear consensus, as Caitlin mentioned in her comments. We had initially kind of settled on, well, maybe we should look at median home value as a way of doing this, and then kind of looked at 800,000 as potentially maybe a middle ground there. I personally was in favor of a limit initially, and then had a number of conversations with folks who could potentially participate in this program, and learned a lot more about the changing nature of retirement and just the costs and the concern that folks have in the community with how much end-of-life care costs. And while there are some significant home values here, those costs and the potential for them are a concern. And that's, I think, what, for me personally, led to not supporting or looking to support a limit on the home value. I think that there were a variety of opinions on this on the working group, and we had some dissenting opinions that were submitted that felt strongly that it should be limited, and those are very well reasoned and valuable opinions, and I think you saw why we were not able to come to a consensus recommendation on this, but think it's certainly a question for whatever future administration, whatever future reviews are done to look at.
Okay, and then would you care to address the exemption versus deferral dynamic?
I think we recognize with our recommendations that with what we've recommended, we will increase the deferral, and we've gone 80,000 and above to up to 99,000. And so that will increase the number of deferrals, and we'll have more of those. And I think there was looking at the slide in particular that compares Arlington to other jurisdictions in the area, shows that our program limits were a little higher, and one of the things the working group felt strongly about was to align it more with what other jurisdictions in the immediate area are doing.
Mr. Holland, if I could just have a follow-up on the exemption versus deferral question, and I don't know whether staff may need to chime in here, but one of the slides talked about an average recoupment, if you will, I guess, of deferred taxes of being approximately $313,000 per year, and yet we have an outstanding amount of deferral funds still to be collected of $3.6 million, over $3.6 million. Could somebody characterize how we go about doing that in a gentle and even-handed manner when somebody has signed up for deferral and then now the time has come for those taxes to be owed? How does that work?
We actually have a new and improved process.
We did. Do you want me to explain? So what we've started to implement this year is when somebody opts for a deferral, whether it's a full deferral or a partial deferral, we will send them a confirmation letter from the Department of Human Services, kind of just reiterating what they've chosen, making sure that that is the choice that they want. And we will retain that in our records and share that with the Treasurer's Office as well. And the Treasurer's Office has actually instituted a new process this year where they will be sending the homeowner a sort of running tally of the deferrals that are owed over time, just so that people get that annual reminder of this is the balance that is owed when you do eventually sell your house or the ownership transfers. And so that wasn't something that was done quite as detailed in the past, but we recognized as we were undertaking this process that it was something we could improve upon. And so the Treasurer's Office really helped us figure out what could be done on both sides to make sure people are constantly reminded of that balance so that it's not something that comes as a surprise when, it sells or changes ownership.
So would you anticipate that instead of an average of a little over $300,000 being collected in the future, that amount should gradually rise as the program administration is tightened up, if you will? Is that fair to say, or?
Well, I think I'm not sure if it'll rise as a result of this process, but I do think that, as Paul mentioned, there will be higher rates of people taking advantage of the deferral as a result of the changes the working group is recommending. So I do think that just by extension, we'll be, realizing more revenue coming back into the county down the road because more people will be taking advantage of deferrals rather than exemptions.
But how are we, or how is the treasurer's office ensuring that funds owed through the deferral processes are ultimately collected, I guess is what I'm asking you as well.
There's also a special designation as part of the property tax record that highlights that deferral is present, and a running tally on the property record as well.
I guess I'll stand.
Kim Rucker is here. Ms. Rucker, remind me of your exact title again.
Chief Deputy Treasurer.
Thank you.
So the taxes aren't actually due until the property changes ownership.
Right.
But we have recognized some issues through this process where it's not always clear what's due on the property, especially we've had heirs come to us from time to time and say, oh, I didn't know that my parents had $10,000 in deferred taxes on the property. So we came up with an annual statement. We're going to make sure that they, as Caitlin said, they sign off saying, yes, I want this deferral. We've also made some enhancements to the website where title companies generally go and check tax balances. It hasn't always been clear that there are deferrals due on the property. You kind of had to dig in, go a few layers down on the website to find it. So over the past couple of years, we've made enhancements there. And we found also that the challenge is Fairfax and Loudoun don't offer deferrals. So title companies weren't always in tune to them and to look for them and to ask the question, are there deferred taxes? So, I guess the answer is we don't know if that annual revenue is going to go up because it's hard to tell when properties are going to change ownership. But we may see it go up, especially as a result of the deferrals. And we've had some people just come to us and say, you know what? People that are in their homes that asked for the deferral, I want to start paying this off, or I want to have it paid off. So we could have some people, when we send these annual statements out, say, oh, I didn't realize it was this much, or I know it's this much, but I want to start paying it off and I want to get it paid off. So it'll be interesting to see when we renew those numbers in the next year or so what it looks like.
So the $3.664 million in outstanding deferred taxes, what does that number represent? Does that represent properties that have changed hands where those funds are owed, or is that the number that is outstanding in terms of current recipients having deferred their taxes?
The current pending
Okay.
deferrals.
All right.
It's a little dated at this point, 6 months or so, I think we provided the number.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. Do we know what the number is, on the other hand, for deferred taxes that are due and owing now that have not yet been collected, notwithstanding the fact that a property has changed hands or transitioned?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can get it and report back.
Okay, I think that'd be helpful. Thank you.
You raised two discrete but significant issues. One was the deferral versus exemption, and the first one was about the home value. If we could,
Yeah.
before we go to Mr. Dorsey, I'd like to just stick with the issue, which is the one you've been following up on a little bit, which is the exemption versus deferral. So I'd ask my colleagues if there are more questions about that to try to talk that through and see if there are more issues on it.
I had a follow-up on the home value cap, the
Let's skip
first
that
of the
one for
two.
the we'll come back to that one.
I'd just like to hear a little more elaboration on the exemption versus deferral. I keep having a hard time with this one. Well, why some people should never have to pay the taxes because it's their heirs that don't have to pay the taxes. It's not them, it seems like to me. But you talked about end-of-life care. But then it gets to, I guess, what the taxpayer should be funding. in a way? I don't know if you want to talk about it a little more.
As well,
Is
if
that
this
what
might be an appropriate opportunity to talk about what I believe was a major issue with the question of deferrals, which is mortgage lenders' policies about deferral. So I think maybe that would be worth surfacing here as well.
I'm gonna speak to that, and then we'll see if Ms. Garvey has, that might be part of the response. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was alluded to earlier, but
Yeah, I mean, I can, this is a question that came up throughout our community engagement process, and something that, we talked through as a working group. And I think for many folks, it's a tool that's available to Arlington County. And it is something that I think for me personally is something that, we look to support the folks in our community who need that support. And I think people felt that the exemption process helps achieve that. I mean, you have.
So my question is, we want to support the people, so they get exempted until they leave the house. Right. And then they don't necessarily need the support. I mean, they've left the house. If it's exempted, then the benefit doesn't really go to them. It gets to whoever inherit. You see what I'm saying? I'm worried that we're supporting more than maybe is necessary. I'm very conflicted on this one.
Yeah, no, I see that point, but I do think there are, I don't think the final move that, and I don't have the full data on this, but the final move that a lot of people in our community are making isn't leaving their home. It's moving from their home to a end of life, or a retirement home. And so they are, the people who are qualifying for this program use that equity, use the value of their home to pay for that end of life care. And folks are living longer now than ever before, and they're relying on that equity that they've built up over time to pay for that end of life care. And I think, I think there's this idea that, heirs are using it to get rich, but I expect that most folks are using it to go to one of the assisted living facilities.
So
in our
I would,
community.
at some point, love to have data. I mean, I think a lot of this we're going to be doing for some data on that, and is there a way to break it out that it's different, that it can stay with that person that we're trying to support, but the benefit does not go to the heirs?
The exemption, the exemption, while in effect, of course, benefits the household who are seniors or those with disabilities who are living in the home, up until the time they either pass on that home or, or are deceased. But then whoever occupies that home is immediately paying taxes on it. So I guess what you're talking about is they would have had a smaller inheritance, perhaps, right?
Right.
But it's not clear, we don't have the data to demonstrate how many of those who are seniors and people with disabilities on real estate tax relief are actually passing their homes on. We don't have that information to tell you what the N is at this point. Plus, I think the other kind of compounding issue with the deferrals was the issue with the mortgage lenders. That there are, at least we know of one mortgage lender, and one of our participants on the working group actually encountered this personally. We're not able to get a mortgage right away because, right?
Yeah, home equity.
Mortgage because the lending agency considers the taxes owed as the first lien against the house.
You go back and explain what that experience was. Somebody must have already had a mortgage.
It's
right?
actually here.
No, so what actually happened is the deferred taxes, the mortgage company did not recognize the deferred taxes as being paid. When you purchase a home and you have a mortgage in place, you're promising to keep things like your taxes current. And a lot of the bigger companies don't see that as being current because at some point in time, they will be due.
Balance due.
Right.
Until you are out of compliance with the terms of your mortgage.
Correct.
Yeah.
I made several complaints to the mortgage holder. I did have the mortgage at that point, but they continued paying my taxes, and the county kept holding onto the check. And paying my taxes and then asking for me to pay more into escrow and declaring me in default of my agreement and pointing out obliquely that they could foreclose. I had tremendous emotional support from the treasurer's office during this confusion. It was competing administrative systems also made it worse on top of the bullying, frankly, and the threats. I complained to the Consumer Protection Bureau, and they were giving an answer by this company that said they were in touch with me and things were being resolved. Well, the resolution was they told me that they couldn't talk about deferrals, that they do not recognize any deferrals in Virginia for any reason, and would not talk with me about it further, and that they still deny the existence of deferrals. All rational conversation about, you mean no senior tax relief, or look at the value of my home? You know, I owe like, what, 15% of the value of my home? The loan to value makes no sense on this. You're saying I can't exercise leverage over my property and my asset value? I've since found out you can't even get a home equity line of credit with some of these things. So there's an aspect of ageism involved also. I did research around the country and found a number of people who had been foreclosed on, including by this company. And in Newport News, that there had been a group that came in to do reverse mortgages, also counseling the people to go get deferrals so that they could be helped to stay in their low-income community and ride through some hardship time. And once they had kind of eaten up the reverse mortgage money that they had done, and the timing was pretty good, it was 3 years, they came in and foreclosed. It was as if they had redlined a neighborhood. So I knew all these things and still do, and the solution was a very oblique, is the kindest word I have for it, where they turned my taxes over to me to pay and said that they would ask for any of the following kinds of documented verification, which would include a check, could include a check, and other things like that. So they didn't let go, is the point there. I learned more about the deferrals and the much more extensive damage that has happened to other people around the country. And that with reverse mortgages, of course, if you've had a deferral, now we found out through this group, you cannot get a reverse mortgage without paying off the deferral. And if we're talking very senior, you could be at the point where you are giving up, you don't get a benefit. You've lost, and if you're very low income, you're now pushed further down.
And the deferral is a better deal than the home equity line or a reverse mortgage, because you don't have to pay an interest on that, right? I mean, the bank, or the mortgage company, the lender is going to charge you an interest, where the deferral is without any interest over time.
It is true, but in terms of public policy, we've got, two apples and oranges there.
Yeah. Mr.
So let me go to Ms. Garvey, sure.
Shaw, yeah, this was very helpful. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that we're going to have to sort of try this, and there are a lot of issues that need to really be worked. Another thing that I realize now connects more than ever is the idea of a cap on the value. So it's just, when I'm looking at, watching taxpayer funds, what I don't want to have happen is an exemption on a home that's worth $1, $2, $3 million, which is not likely, but is certainly possible, and it's exempted for all these reasons, and the heirs inherit this house that the tax, it hasn't been paying its taxes, and people get a windfall on, the heirs.
But they have to pay the taxes.
And
If it's exempted,
if it's been exempted, not
it's been
deferred.
exempted
I
all the way
do
along. You
wonder
don't.
if,
I'm just worried about one of those odd things, and I think we could probably put in a small protection for that and figure out these other things, because certainly we need to protect
I think
folks like
that's
you.
among the kinds of things where we found data was really missing at a granular level for studying these things, that we were all dealing with a certain sets of belief systems that we couldn't ground And who are these people? What are the value of the property? And things like that. I know as a participant, I have no access to the property as an asset. So, that, I don't see how you can count, it's not a liquid asset.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Mr. Chair,
Even more.
Before we go on, because I know, Libby, Christian's been dying to say something, as is
But she
Katie.
can finish this conversation. I mean, this is a discussion, so I'm happy to have her finish it before I weigh in.
Okay, then
Well,
we'll
I
go
was
back
just
to
going to
Libby.
conclude that actually where I am is that there's data that, there's a lot of study that needs to happen, and I'm worried about windfalls that are improper. I think first we need to protect folks like you and do what we can, I think, here. And this is something we're going to have a lot of work on. I expect change it as we go, because there are all of these, circumstances that
I
are
don't
hard to predict.
understand your use of windfall when the taxes are going to be paid.
Because if I pass on my home, I haven't been paying taxes, and say my home's worth, it's not anything there, say my home's worth $2 million, and I have not been paying taxes, so that in the Treasury, in the Arlington County Treasury, there are taxes that haven't been paid, my heirs inherit it at $2 million. You see, and then they start paying taxes from then on. But the taxes that were there to support me have supported me, but allowed my heirs to inherit a home at $2 million when perhaps I've already gotten, there's 50,000 or more that I should have paid, that the taxpayers have made. Does that make sense?
I think there are more data points that need to get into that discussion, because if you've got a $2 million house, you have the equivalent expenses of maintenance and upkeep, and then what's your income, and how you spent down your assets, and how you're really becoming impoverished in your house.
if I may, I just wanted to suggest, I think one thing that could be helpful sort of in this narrative or this concern, which I know you've raised before about, sort of the relationship between the home ownership and whether it goes on to heirs, or as Mr. Holland suggested, whether that is the capital that people then extract, or the equity that people then extract to pay for long-term care. I presume we have a data point, the Treasurer's Office might have a data point about when someone exits the program, either deferral or exemption, whatever category, what happens next, right? Whether they are selling, or whether they are exiting the program because of death, unfortunately, and it's going on to an heir, or whether they're exiting the program because they're moving into a new home in Arlington or elsewhere. And I wonder, having a sense of that difference, where people go next, the reasons for exiting the program, might be helpful, right? If we're learning, in fact, that the vast majority of recipients are moving on somewhere next to supported living, downsizing, et cetera, maybe that would address some of the concern that I know you've raised before, Ms. Garvey.
I'm really looking at the outlier situations, and that's not what we want to basically do. What we do need to be aware of those. No, I think there's a lot of data points we need.
Could you
I have
identify,
one
just
more.
for everybody's benefit, including those watching, could you identify yourself again for everybody?
My name is Jill Herndon, and I have one more thing to say about the deferral aspect in the situation, the stress of not knowing if I would be foreclosed on. On behalf of other people who may come into this situation, which would be anybody probably getting a mortgage after 2008 from one of the big companies. Please help them. Please find some way to champion their cause. I couldn't take the stress anymore and listed the house yesterday. And I didn't want to move. Now I'm creating a happy future for myself, but I would have liked to have had the opportunity to stay here after moving here 40 years ago, substitute teaching, and really being a member of the community and my community association.
Thank you. I thought it had been resolved. I'm so sorry.
Okay, Christian, let's go to you.
Thank you, and Ms. Herndon, thank you for sharing that, and I'm saddened that we couldn't have a better result, and I think it really speaks to, just taking a step back to think about what this program, with both of its dimensions and exemption and deferral, are designed to do, and, deferral obviously is in the best interests of the municipality if you narrowly defined it as the way to capture back as much of what you have granted as relief at some point. But from the perspective of an individual homeowner, it is clearly not a desirable option. And as we think about the most vulnerable seniors I think we'd have to think about what the impact would be if they were left with no other option. There were no exemption, and there were only deferral, as is, I guess, the case in some communities. What those homeowners are faced with, as Ms. Herndon described, are making the momentary decision based on an inability to pay real estate taxes that impacts their leverage decisions with their greatest household asset for the remainder of their life in ways that they may not fully comprehend at the very beginning. And for a municipality to sort of be the conduit for people to make the momentary decision, this is how I have to live, uncoupled from these are the implications that I'll be faced with for the rest of my life, that's something that's tough for me to stomach for the most vulnerable. Now, for people who have assets, whether they be income or actual assets, deferral becomes a viable option if it's just a matter of smoothing what might be some cash flow issues that they may have from time to time and year to year, and having that as an option, a desirable option for them, I think is well worth it. But I for one, am very much of the opinion that for the most vulnerable, exemption is really what, as a municipality, we ought to be doing, because the deferral option does impact leverage to a substantial degree. And I, for one, am fine with the air scenario, because this is a program for the homeowner. And what happens after they move on, I can live with the consequences. As has been established, if the average recipient is in the program for 8 years, we're not talking about a substantial amount of money that would be, sort of a windfall for someone who becomes an heir. It's probably very limited in terms of the actual cash that could be clawed back, but the impact for the homeowner while they are in the property is substantial. So I can live with those consequences, those rare outlier events, and I'll just take this opportunity, Mr. Fazette, to just get at my other question, if that's okay, if we finish with this particular.
Actually, I just want to check and make sure,
Yeah.
because I'd rather flesh this one out, and then I'll come back to you for the very next topic, if you don't mind. So others on this, is there anything
Yes.
more? Mr. Vice
Yeah, just a follow-up. I'm the county board's representative to the Virginia Association of Counties, and Katie is, of course, our representative to VML, the Virginia Municipal League. So I reached out to VACO to see what is transpiring on this dynamic in deferrals versus exemption, specifically on the question of why we can't get these mortgage companies to accommodate the needs of of senior citizens who are in need of some degree of relief. And I'm happy to just say that I got a short email from the VACO Director of Local Government Policy, who is saying that the Virginia Council on Aging, which, Ms. Friedman, I know you're familiar with the Virginia Council on Aging because it's composed of senior citizen stakeholders from all over the state, has recently convened a group of stakeholders to discuss the conflicts encountered regarding lien priority in this type of situation, and also with respect to home equity loans. So he also indicates that Carla de la Pava has been contacted, our county treasurer, and that Carla has leapt at the opportunity of serving as a resource and participating in this. So that is really great news. And the one thing I wanted to bring up with the managers, we also have the PACE program, the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, on a completely different note, which is a loan program which is intended to encourage folks to convert it to solar energy. And of course, that solar program, the PACE program, also has a kind of a financing mechanism similar to this, where mortgage lenders insist on that first lien position, and that is also thwarting the conversion to solar energy on the part of homeowners who might like to use that. So I don't know, Mr. Manager, if you have anything to say in that regard, but there might be an opportunity for linkage here where we can get better mortgage company cooperation, both with respect to senior citizens tax relief as well as solar energy conversion.
It's worth looking into, absolutely.
on this.
Thank you.
Did you have something on this topic, Ms.
I'm
Christie?
nodding as Mr. Vice talks and just wanted to suggest too, perhaps even more so than VACO or VML, we might find common cause with other very high income communities that have seen the sort of strong rises in property values that we've seen here in Arlington County. I mean, best I can tell, the challenge with the mortgage lenders is they worry that they'll end up with a property underwater where there's more tax revenue owed on a property than they can recoup. I think that feels so rare. As it was mentioned, we're talking here, about the carried taxes, 10, 15%. And so the point that we're trying to make is actually Arlington and communities like us are quite distinct from other parts of the country. And so, as we look to sort of make common cause or do our best effort to persuade some of those mortgage companies, we might find, reaching out to San Francisco's or bedroom communities in New York City might be good partners in that, because I imagine they're contending with some of the same issues.
The only thing I'd add to that, I think the conversation's been really good. And we all would understand if you lend somebody something, you want to be able to get paid back, for example. So it strikes me that the real issue here is the loan to value, question, and having that built into the code or the regulations or the implementation makes some sense. If in fact, the deferrals add up over the course of some period of time, when adding it to the reverse mortgage amount or the home equity line, and you've all of a sudden gotten to 80% or 90% of the value, then you may have a question, you may have an issue. But it seems to me that may be something that could, as we look at whether there's potential legislative action, or that may be the angle that seems to make the most sense to me, to incorporate that dimension of the issue into the discussion.
I think we might need to consult with the county attorney. That might require a state code change, because the current enabling legislation, via the state is really focused on income and asset value, and that sort of adding a new criteria regarding loan to value. I just want to say we need a lot more research on that. So
Referencing the state legislation, not local. I mean, I'm sure we don't have the authority to do that. But to the degree there is some follow-up and discussion with Pat Carroll and others about what makes the most sense to take into a legislative arena and see if our legislators think there's some logic to this, that seems to me to be the framing of it. And the only other question I have on this discussion is, when you spoke to people, or when the task for the working group tried to assess the reasons why, I'm presuming that very few percentage of those that qualify for deferral take it. What did you find? Because one of the things you just said is, with the recommendation, we are likely to have a lot more deferrals. And I don't know that that's the case. You have about 30 people you've identified, right? You've identified with the proposal from the group and lowering the income level for exemptions. You identify that there are about 30 households that are currently qualifying for and getting an exemption that would no longer qualify. I think they would qualify for deferral. So you're presuming that they would all take a deferral, and my gut tells me from past experience that the vast majority of them will not choose to take a deferral, and that's maybe one of the things that were this to go forward, we would certainly want to track and understand. So the front end question is, what did you find out about why people that qualify for deferral choose not to take it?
Well, I don't know if we have that question. Amy might know what the answer to that, but we experience that on average there are many more households who qualify deferral than actually take them.
And
that's
what is
why
that number? Give us
it's
that.
about 30%, we estimated.
30% what?
Those who qualify for a deferral actually
Take it.
take a deferral, which is why,
Thirds don't.
right,
Okay.
which is why on slide 19, when we were considering those who would lose their exemption at the upper income limits between 80,000 and 99,472, and they would be now eligible for deferral, we projected only a third would actually take the deferral.
Right. And did you get any information, anecdotal or otherwise, through discussions about what their rationale is for not taking a deferral?
Well, I think Amy Yorsick may know that. No?
As Paul mentioned, when we spoke with people in the surveys, the focus groups, and then also at the community meeting, a number of people did talk about the fact that their home was their primary asset, and their plan all along has been to use the proceeds from the sale of their home to pay for their assisted living or whatever the next step may be. And many people said, when I leave my home, I'm going to an assisted living facility. I'm not moving to a condo. I'm not moving to be closer to my grandkids or whatever. You know, I'm going to an assisted living facility. So a lot of them really...
they paid the taxes. So they ended up paying the taxes.
Right, because if you look at slide 9, you actually see that out of the 929 people in calendar year 2016 that received some sort of real estate tax relief benefit, 639 got a full exemption. The remaining people who didn't get a full exemption, whether it was 50% or 25%, they could actually defer, you know, the balance of their taxes that they, you know, are not exempt from paying. But not all of them choose to.
Let me see if I clarify that. Anyone that got a full exemption understood, but if you got a 50% exemption, by the rules, you have the ability to defer the other 50%.
Correct.
And obviously, most of them don't.
Our experience shows that about a third of them defer some or all of their remaining balance, but then 2/3 do not.
Well, I mean, and this is kind of the question I'm asking. The best answer you have is similar to what Paul said, which is whether logical or not logical or makes sense or doesn't make sense, the rationale is they're just choosing not to take the deferral because the value of their home is, they're looking at it as an asset they want to cash in on later.
Yes.
For later needs.
Because if you look at slide 10, you also see that about half of our households have $100,000 or less in assets. So, I mean, I do think that that percentage speaks to the fact that, you know, their home is their asset, and it's not money that's sitting in the bank.
And if you want to add to this,
And we also do,
Yeah.
Amy, yours, we also do have many household members that, many household participants that say they don't want their family to have to pay their debt when
Right.
when their house sells if they move on somewhere else.
right, okay. Well, it strikes me that this is an area that, you know, to the degree there's more information, great, but the task force decided, and this is maybe to any of you, the task force decided that on balance, for some reasons, it was okay to remove the 30 households from their exemption, right? And knowing that 2/3 of them would still then not take a deferral. And the reason was because,
Well, what I said before, I think we wanted to see a program that was more in line with other jurisdictions in the area. You know, if you look at the comparison chart, we were, you know, income was very high.
in line on the income.
Yes.
Top income level with the other localities. That's sort of the primary reason, right?
Yeah, and if you look at the asset data as well, in general, the participants, you know, you're talking 12 households above $400,000 in assets, in household assets. So, you know, out of 920, I think, you're talking about 12 with 400 plus. So by, you know, by changing, we felt we weren't affecting that many folks. I mean, obviously, it's a very personal program, and every household, every one of those numbers is an individual household that will be affected. But, you know, looking at the numbers, that's kind of where we.
And I think Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think from the conversations that the working group had, I gathered that, you know, the households that would be affected from moving that upper income limit from $99,472 to $80,000 in order to qualify for an exemption, if they still really need that real estate tax relief, they do still qualify for it, and it's in the form of a deferral. And we're going to make some changes to like the application materials to make sure that they don't put themselves in a situation where, if they do have a mortgage or a reverse mortgage, they're in some more difficult situations than they began. But, there is still that option available for those higher income households. And then on top of that, the changes with the income exemptions, things like disability income, and relatives in the home who are non-owner, non-spouses, being able to deduct those from the totals also would bring a number of households down in terms of the income that's counting towards the limit.
Just to say, I think we're going to go over here for a comment on it. Should this go forward as proposed, it seems like we have a strong responsibility to work directly with households that, where a situation might change, to educate them completely about the options still available to them. Yeah.
Thank you. I just had one more issue on the deferrals with, in the lenders. When there is a lien, when a property is sold and there are deferred taxes, the county only has lien priority for 10% of the sale price. I think that's something to consider when there are liens against the property.
Say it again.
So if, for repayment of deferred taxes, we have first lien on taxes. But when it's deferred taxes, we only have first lien up to 10% of the sale price.
10% of the sale price. So
By code.
Okay, so if the deferral amount cumulatively exceeds that,
Correct.
then we move to a second or third position after we get that
After
first.
other liens, correct.
This has been unpersuasive to the mortgage lenders. Because in some ways, we have by policy what you were just alluding to, Jay, is something we might try to codify. One might think that would be
them some
assuaging, but apparently not.
Well, that's still contrary to an industry accustomed to first position, regardless of any amount. So,
The 90%.
Right. On the other hand, it's also true that, and do we even know this, Ms. Friedman, what percentage of our beneficiary universe even has a mortgage? I mean, is that question asked now? I believe we're going to be asking that in the future.
We don't know on this specific household, but we do know that Arlington homeowners 65 and older, there's 40% of them have mortgages.
40%, so a minority, but we don't know within the subset of what we're talking about here. Okay, thank you.
We do plan to add that to the application materials at the working group's recommendation so that we will begin collecting that information in the future.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to know if there's more on this topic. Ms. Garvey?
I guess all of this is making clear how important the, all of this is making really clear how important it is that your recommendation to increase the outreach efforts in the work. So you've mentioned a little bit, if somebody comes to you, how much sort of counseling do they get, financial? Because I would imagine most people that come really need a fair amount of help understanding the situation and what's going on. And I presume we provide that, but maybe we could be providing more.
If you want to do a quick response, because I want to get to some of that. It's a new topic.
Yeah,
and
okay, it is sort of, yes.
one if you want to, but then let's go to the next topics. Mr. Dorsey had one.
We have a sort of bare bones staff to manage this program, and so it's largely oriented towards processing the applications. However, given that it's embedded in the Department of Human Services, as we encounter households who are either in financial straits or, medical issues, we then do a referral process internally to our own. We have our own, financial literacy people in-house in the department. We have case managers who can help with whatever that household may need.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think this may be an area where we need to, and I think we've heard this before, we need to step up. You may need some more resources to properly serve
That's part of the
folks.
recommendation of the working group, is to enhance the technical assistance.
Get to that part. I think everyone agrees on more outreach. I'm not sure. I personally agree with more money to do it, but that's a different question. Mr. Dorsey, you're next.
thank you, Mr. Facette. Let me just echo Mr. Weistat and you, Mr. Chairman, and thanking the working group, Chairman Holland. Great work on a very dense, difficult subject that not only involves, understanding code and being able to apply that to local ordinance and, putting together various detailed matrix of categories that you'd like to include, but you had the overlay of having a work group that was comprised or composed, I always get those mixed up, of individuals who are directly affected by this program, who have the lived experience of what this is all about. And that just adds a different lens to some public policy deliberation. So I thank you all for taking it on and doing what I think is a very thorough job. As I look at sort of the recommendations, effectively, you're looking to make the program easier to understand and administer, which I think you've done a great job in moving towards that goal, trying to focus on providing the bulk of the help for people that have a clear need, and limiting the ability for people with less need and more resources to participate at the expense of others. Very, very noble. So along the lines of just looking at your recommendations, which I'm generally supportive of moving forward with, especially considering this is our first attempt to look at the program as a whole in a while. But there's one area that does give me a little bit of trouble, and it's in looking at the asset limits and how we're going to go about thinking about them in the future.
What slide, Mr. Dorsey?
So we can look at slide 17, final recommendations. 17 and 18, I think, covers this.
Okay.
And so we have increased the asset limit for exemptions to 400. Can you just speak a little bit about what the rationale was there?
Sure. So, as I'm sure you're aware, retirement is changing. Less and less people are on a defined benefit pension, and more folks rely on a 401k to fund their retirement costs. Under the program, 401k value is included in the asset calculation, whereas pension is not. I mean, obviously, pension would count as income, but that's something we're conscious of. And I think as you see an increase in the number of people who have a 401k to fund their retirement, that asset limit will need to be adjusted even further. And so by raising it up to 400,000, there was a recognition amongst the working group that retirement is changing, the nature of retirement is changing, more folks have a need to have higher asset levels, and we felt it was important to respond to that.
Thank you. And the next piece, forgive me, it's a little bit on the nerdy side, but the goal has been to make this a little easier to administer, but then we have the added layer of putting on staff, looking at deductions from assets. And what I would suggest or recommend that you consider in future iterations of this, instead of tying the increase in assets to the CPIU, the Consumer Price Index for urban areas, which, it does include 80% of the population, so it is very well representative of urban areas. It doesn't do a great job of specifically targeting the impact of inflationary costs on the elderly. There is an experimental price adjuster by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, CPIE, which takes into account housing and the medical costs for the elderly, which are higher than in the general population. And what you could do if that were the inflation adjuster, it would limit the necessity to kind of consider expense deductions because it's built into the way the CPI is calculated. So I would think that would just be a little bit easier way for people to predictably be able to calculate whether or not they're going to qualify, and for staff to administer it, as opposed to the very manual process of people, putting together receipts and trying to figure out what's eligible to be deducted, other people making a determination. If we had a way of just building that in to how assets are looked at on an annual basis, that to me seems to make a lot of sense.
Could staff respond to that? Did you discuss that concept at all?
Yes, we actually, the working group itself didn't recommend one CPI over another, but we did have some pretty extensive conversations on CPIE in general. The CPIU was inserted there by staff, since that is generally the CPI that is used across the county for those sort of inflationary adjustments. The CPIE was not included only because of the fact that at this point in time it is experimental and it is not regularly updated fully updated in the way that CPIU is. But we recognize the value of that, and should it become more widely, used and more regularly updated in the future, we would welcome the use of that.
Kind of my work. It's been experimental for 28 years, so it's kind of baked in. It's just that there's no requirement for BLS to sort of elevate it to a level of being something that is published regularly, and it's always available for free by request from BLS. And just as various think tanks and research groups have tracked over the years, while it is designated as experimental, it has proven to be pretty accurate and well received among the aging community as being reflective of the particular cost pressures on that demographic. So
Is it available annually?
it's available, it's available quarterly by request.
As often then as the other? Okay, okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One quick follow-up on this for myself is you apply to the CPIU to the assets, not the income. Did you discuss that?
The income would be adjusted in relation to the changes in the area median income each year?
And that's in here as well. That's not done now, though.
No.
In both instances, however, one of the guiding principles or recommendations is to have an annual sort of automatic adjustment based on one of these
Correct.
indices.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right,
Because in the
that-
past, we haven't had that kind of annual adjustment, and it's been,
got it. Okay, thank you. Other
in the
questions? Ms. Crystal?
Actually, would love to pull up on that same question because I did as I was sort of interacting with the new proposed exemptions or exclusions. I think they're all really fair and thoughtful and actually help serve the goal that Mr. Dorsey referenced, which is trying to target this program at those of the greatest need. I do wonder, however, if those, these new exemptions, deductions, exclusions start to work in contrast to another program goal, and actually one that I think in the survey data was highlighted as one of the most important, which was making the application and reapplication process simpler. And I know from the Rheingold data, 71% of surveyed homeowners and 100% of focus group participants supported that end. So there's sort of this potentially maybe some tension about changes to elements of the program better refine and target the goals, but could actually be making the process more complex. I don't know that there's a clear answer to that. Probably having well-informed eligibility worker staff is incredibly critical. But I would love any insights from the working group as you all wrestled with that tension and the way you thought about it or where you came down.
So I think where we kind of came down on it was that we felt it would be a very small percentage of potential participants who, the number of folks who would actually be looking at these sorts of exemptions and dental expenses or emergency home repairs would be very small, because it's folks who are really kind of on the edge of qualifying and just need a little bit of documentation to get them underneath the asset limit. So I think for the vast majority of folks, I would expect that the majority of people who are participating in the program are not kind of on the edge here of qualification. So that's kind of how we, when we were discussing this, came down on it.
For most folks, it'll be fairly clear whether they qualify or not. It's a small percentage that'll be on the bubble, so to speak. Okay.
At some point, just to follow up on it, is a good question. Anyone that qualifies now qualifies without those additional exemptions, right? So really what you're looking at is some marginal group of people who may not yet qualify, right, who could, or some of those who, with this set of recommendations, might lose a qualification but still qualify with some of these additional exemptions.
exactly, right.
Okay, fair question.
And I think we did hear from, and I think it was reflected in the Affordable Housing Master Plan, that condo owners are particularly vulnerable because of the assessments that are levied against them. So this was a way to recognize that they need some assistance.
I'd like to go back then to Mr. Weisstat's earlier question. There were 3 or 4 things I think we want to touch on, at least I have on a list, the outreach a little bit, which Ms. Garvey raised earlier, the home value, program management, and then the budget, and there may be other policy questions. But let's go to the home value that was raised earlier on and see, how would you like to phrase a question on that, Mr. Weissstadt? so
Thank
that
you.
we can begin this conversation again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I honestly have not come to a firm conclusion on whether or not the home value should be capped or made a criteria, which is why I am suggesting that we direct the manager to look into the question a little more. So I do have some language, and I don't know, Hope Halleck, I know you have a copy of it. I don't know if you're prepared to show it on the screen. But I can just read it. It's just one sentence. The board directs the manager to study the policy and practical implications of addressing property value, considering either or both land and improvements as a criterion for seniors' property tax relief, so that the board may consider this metric in the context of the fiscal year 2019 county budget and in developing any necessary changes to the Arlington County Code. So what I'm concerned about is that it's certainly on the surface, I think that there's a fiscal dynamic at play here, obviously, because any tax relief costs our Treasury money, but it's the right thing to do in certain circumstances. But there's also an equity issue as to, what is the value of an individual's home, how big of a lot it's situated on, and so forth. We know that a number of other jurisdictions have certain limits, as we saw in one of the charts. So this language is intended to be broad enough that the manager is going to give us some feedback on the policy and practical dynamics.
Let me follow up just to get some clarity. We're not going to be taking particular motions, but let's talk about what you're recommending. And let me go to the manager first and ask, at least based on the language up on the screen, how do you react to that in terms of operationalizing it or going beyond what was already done?
So
what added
I
value?
think that's something that we should take a look at as we're preparing the 2019 budget. We have to do so in concert with the county attorney also, because there are some legal issues that I think are best. Feel free to weigh in here, Michelle, because you've talked. They're sort of a little bit murky at the moment, whether we have the ability to actually include this, and if we can include it, whether we can split out the land from the improvements.
Whether we have the...
I have that last phrase about to the county code.
Yeah, it's a question about breaking out the improved versus land value. They wanted to think about it more, so.
Okay.
But I mean, that sort of gets to the very end of the conversation, which is my anticipation at the end of this that you'll have some consensus recommendation that it would be my hope, whatever that is, that we include it as part of the proposed upcoming, the fiscal 19 budget.
Speak to that then briefly so we understand the context, which is the timeline for your recommended timeline in implementing these recommendations.
So we are recommending that we start the implementation of the Phase 1 recommendations immediately. That would be now July. Some of them will go quickly, administrative, programmatic, most likely. Code changes will require, of course, a longer amount of time because those in them, not just working with the county attorney, but they also require an additional public process. And so if we are able to wrap those up by, let's say, the end of, a year from now, right? We should be in time for knowing some implications for fiscal year 19.
Right, so that's for implementation for a year from now. What we would do is typically when we come forward with the budget in February, we include a number of things that we advertise, and we would include any of these code changes as part of the advertisements in February.
So I guess my confusion in this is
The fiscal year
that it's
19 or 20?
suggesting that we begin, your request is that we authorize you to begin implementing the Phase 1 recommendations, all right, to be completed by the end of next year, a year and a half from now, right? So when we say that, that included some different calculations for assets and income, but you're not really changing the income and asset levels until
Those require Those require code changes. What I was recommending, and the board can say to do it more aggressively, I was recommending we include those as proposals as part of the fiscal 19 budget in February as adoption in April, and they would go into effect
in January of 19.
Right.
Okay, and that's all I'm trying to clarify is the language leads one to believe begin implementation, but it's taking the administrative steps
Right.
to actually affect the changes in calculating income and assets, et cetera, not for a year and a half. But you want to prepare for it. You want to do whatever code changes are necessary. You want to do it. But I don't want people to think that we begin implementing different income and asset levels now. We wouldn't be actually starting them until January of 19.
That's correct.
Okay, so it's just a language.
I just want to add that part of the practical reason for that is because, as Anita and Mark were saying, these are code changes. So you have an RTA, we're too late for July, do you know what I mean? And an advertisement, and the program is on a January 1st, 16 basis, and we're affecting 900 people's households. We want to have the full time to really, as you said, educate them on the changes, because a lot of people will move between categories, and this whole thing, we're really affecting people's day-to-day lives, and so that's why we need that time. And that's also why the program, we need to settle in for a few years before we make additional changes, because there's a lot of back and forth that will need to happen with staff, so.
I personally appreciate it. I don't particularly have a problem. I just wanted to make sure we all understood what the words begin implementation meant. So it's really the administrative preparation for starting these changes, in fact, in January of 19. So that's the first part. Now let's go to what was on the screen, which was, is that consistent with the language up here, right? That there's no problem with implementing that. Okay, got it. So let's talk about the substance of it. Christian?
Yeah, thank you. I think as the work group kind of wrestled with, it may not be so much, or it is partly an issue of whether or not you think there ought to be a cap at all, but then there's the secondary question of what should the cap be and what's fair and what makes sense and how do you calculate it, and I think those are useful research questions for staff to consider. I, for one, do believe, regardless of how few households seem to be at what might be, universally considered high levels like $1 million or above, even though it includes relatively a few number of households, I do think it's important to make a statement about who this program is for. And if we can clearly determine those whom we deem to be most in need, it's our responsibility to the entire community to do so and to not allow people who have the wherewithal to pay their taxes and to not require relief, not to get it. It's not a matter of being punitive to anyone who is, at this point, enjoyed the real estate tax relief, but to, quite frankly, be fair to the entire Arlington community. So I hope we can come at something that makes sense.
Katie?
Yeah, I wanted to just transfer a piece of a conversation we were having earlier to this question about caps on property values, because I think even with additional guidance or requests for staff expertise, I don't know that the working group is going to continue to meet, so I want to make sure we extract and surface all of the nuance of your conversations about this. So one of the working group members, a dissenting member, had written to us that, concerned that there are other resources not taken into account for folks in homes which are valued well above the median, reverse mortgages, home equity lines of credit. Mr. Holland, you had mentioned sort of as you learned more about some of the decisions people enter into with regard to long-term care, that they're looking at their home as a source of equity to pay for that. Is that also true, and did that also sort of shade the conversation about caps? The people, even in homes well above the median, anticipate that's the amount of the value of their home, even if it's above the median, is commensurate with what they'll need to pay for end of life or long-term care. Any reflections you can add for us?
Yeah, so just a little bit talking through the process of the working group, we had 3 subcommittees, and the subcommittee on program management looked at this issue very closely, and we had four members, including myself, who were on that. And we initially talked about having maybe, it's as you saw in the recommendations, maybe it's the median home value, and then we talked maybe a multiplier of what that median home value is. And I do think the working group was split on where we should kind of come down on this issue, and that's why we weren't able to come to a consensus of a recommendation. And I think there were some very good points raised in the dissenting opinion, and certainly a valuable perspective there. I think that, something like a reverse mortgage, I think, has a very negative connotation, and, based on the historic thoughts around that term, but I think there may be an evolution in reverse mortgages and just a new, kind of a new approach that the federal government is taking to them that could present an alternative way of having, of funding or looking at a different approach to how we do this.
And are there any comments that you would raise for us now as we consider this? I'd probably associate myself with Mr. Dorsey's point of view about really wanting to continue to refine this program, and if this might be one way in which we do that. So, obviously this wasn't a recommendation of the working group for a reason. So are there any points that you would leave us with in terms of those members of the working group who felt the greatest concern about instituting a cap at the median or a multiplier level?
I'd have to go back and look through the notes. I mean, it's just been a few months.
Committed to memory the minutes of each subgroup meeting.
I'm not, but I mean, I think it comes down to kind of what I was saying before from my personal perspective, which is that folks have they don't have a lot in the way of other assets besides their home and yeah.
Ms. Garvey?
I think.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I was just going to respond to Katie, if you didn't mind.
Sorry.
Really, I think the nice thing about the working group is that we had really, I think, all aspects of the spectrum of points of view. And that, to some extent, that's a negative because we couldn't come to necessarily a consensus right away, but we did pull ourselves in towards the center. But, the folks who are on the affordable housing side of the argument believe that there should be a cap to the home value because we shouldn't be, along the equity issue, benefiting individuals who really have that kind of resource in their home, to the detriment, so to speak, because if you're taking $4 million, right, it's $4 million, it's not going to some other, either the general fund or to the purpose of helping very low income seniors and people with disability. And I'm looking at Catherine Scruggs right now. And then the other side of the argument was, well, no, if you have your retirement assets and your 401ks that have been established and they're there sitting in the value of your home, that's what you're banking on for whenever you end up in that ultimate situation where you're going to be in high cost assisted living or end of life.
Well, we're going to go on to another topic, but just my own, it won't add a lot of insight into this. I don't really know where the staff can add a lot of new value to this, but I think it's fine to, I don't oppose the suggestion that you keep looking at it and that it's really a difficult question. It strikes me that the thing I'd be most concerned about is not disadvantaging somebody who happened to have bought a house and lived in it 40 or 50 years, and then all the big McMansions that grew up around them drives their home value up to a point that, they're paying the penalty for it. On the other hand, the person that has the modest home, like everyone else, and is now has just invested $300,000 or $400,000 into a home somehow, I don't look kindly on that as much, that person qualifying for an exemption if they've had the ability to enhance their home some way. So how you actually parse all those scenarios, and are we looking at the value of a home or the net of what's not outstanding in terms of owed on that home, but you don't want to drive someone to go borrow off of it to be able to qualify because the net puts them in the qualification range. So I think it becomes quite complicated, and good luck on that. Good luck on that conversation. So that's about all I can add to it. Is a little more of the challenge I think you will confront. Ms. Garvey.
I'll build a little on what you were saying too, because it occurs to me too, a lot of our most vulnerable don't own homes. and this is just, again, how we continue to support home ownership and people who are lucky enough and up at a certain income level to own homes, and it kind of just increases the divide. So there's a lot to consider. I think I'll say, we're getting to the end, so I'm going to say my thank yous. We've been sort of thinking about this for a while, and I think we all had the sense that this was kind of a big, complex sort of issue, and it sure is. More complex than maybe at least I had anticipated. I think with the coming wave of aging baby boomers, it's more and more important, and which actually, so thank you for that. And actually, don't lose the people that were in this group. I hope Ms. Herndon maybe is staying close to Arlington, even if you're leaving your home. So are you staying are you staying in Arlington? Are you able to stay?
Sorry, I just want to get to some of the last issues before we do our closing comments.
That was my closing. I won't talk again, but I had one question. I won't, I promise. I was just hoping, I was going to express a desire that I hope Ms. Herndon is going to be able to stay in Arlington, and that we keep this, because this seems like a wonderful group because of the disparate opinions that you had. My question, looking at the whole issues that have been raised and how much need there is that why was in the 3 to 5 year time frame the considering implementing additional programs for relief for residents for seniors and residents with disabilities? Because it seems to me maybe that might be something that you could pull up a little earlier. Other ways to address this, which of course, as I say, gets to the issue of people who don't happen to be lucky enough to own a home, but still have needs and may need to go to a retirement place, but don't have that home to fall back on.
Well, those certainly are priorities. I think that since those will require larger community conversations, we're predicting that in true Arlington fashion, a robust community discussion takes some time, and so it wasn't going to be something in phase 1. But we could certainly initiate it.
Well, that's kind of where I was headed, at least start it, and I understand that these things can take time. Those are basically my closing comments. Thank you very much, everybody. This has been a great discussion.
Mr. Fazette, just to follow up on that, there is one recommendation in phase 3 which talks about looking at ways of having more multi-generational housing and some of those opportunities. And I think we need to think outside the box. I mean, what are the universities here? What are the ways to promote more multi-generational housing? As you mentioned, by 2040, I think the population above the age of 65 is going to double in the Commonwealth. So it's a lot of changes coming.
Okay, let me ask, one of the things I think we wanted to weigh in on and give comment on, which has been a question at some points in the community, is program management. Again, your working group did not come up with a clear recommendation, as far as I remember, but would it be useful for this board to do so? The 3 options are leaving it here in the manager, under the manager, sending it to the Commissioner of the Revenue, or doing some hybrid. And it might be good to finalize that discussion. Is there anyone who thinks it should be changed from the management where it's done now in DHS?
I would just say that there are certainly compelling reasons to think about it staying in DHS. There are compelling things to think about where it could be located if it were different. I have yet to really see any coherent analysis that gives me the sense that there is a no-brainer solution here. And, I think instead of focusing on where it's housed, we should figure out what are the advantages maybe that we could, or what are the potential benefits that would be derived from it being in a different location, and seeing if we might export them to the current location, because I don't think there's an either or that produces any, as this process has gone through, I don't see how moving it will allow it to be delivered any more efficiently or more effectively. If there are areas where we think that there could be marginal improvement, let's figure out how to export them to DHS, is where I sit right now.
Okay, am I hearing any? Mr. Vista?
The only dynamic I would share is that, I think we heard a little bit earlier in our conversation today how important it is to link folks who may need, or who are taking advantage or availing themselves of assistance in one area. They may have other needs as well. They may have mental health needs, they may have physical health needs, and so forth. And it just strikes me that our Department of Human Services may be in a better position to help coordinate those types of services than, say, the Commissioner of the Revenue would.
And I think this is what Ms. Garvey mentioned earlier, is the outreach. While there is a substantial amount of outreach done now, I think this process unveiled a lot more opportunity to go beyond, especially in this transition period, but permanently as well. Ms. Garvey?
Yes, I said I wouldn't talk again, I'm sorry. They did say they have 2 pages of outreach that could still be done. It brings me to another data point. Do you know how many people who are in this program also access other services? I think you do. I think I've seen that. So that would be useful to know.
Right, that access other DHS services.
Because
Okay.
that would make,
So I just,
Done.
we seemingly settled that one, no other strong points of view. Can I speak to the budget? I don't think I'll be here in the spring, so are you talking, Mr. Manager, about this recommendation for additional funds being taken up in the spring? Built into your, like, if we said yes to your recommendations, does that mean you'd be building these funds into your base budget?
So I'm going to dodge that question by only saying that if we do this, we will need an additional FTE. That doesn't mean that I'm asking the board right now to raise taxes to put in another FTE. That could be done through reallocation. It could be done through, I'm just saying the size of this program would have to be a little bit bigger than it is now by those amounts.
I would just ask why. I mean, honestly, I'm just not clear why it would have to be bigger, because what we're doing is changing some income and asset levels, doing some,
I'm going to let Anita talk about that.
Well,
I don't know why. Tell me why.
if I brought Amy Yorsick up here, she would start going down the litany. But when you are going to add additional calculation considerations, right?
These are the calculations for
Deductions.
the ones we just focused on and said it would not apply to very many people, right? Aren't those the ones we're talking about?
If they are, I mean, we don't know what the end will be, but if they are only minimal,
We can't argue both sides of
no,
that.
no. But, I work for the county manager, and Paul Holland is the representative of the working group, so we don't always have the same aligned
Okay.
priorities. My priority is to do our work efficiently and effectively so that people can get their benefits in a prompt way. But, so, we are in a bureaucracy. Anytime you have new rules and regulations and calculations, you have to set up policies and protocols so that they're transparent for the public to see. All the administrative changes that are required will take some time. The outreach will take time. I have 0.75 person FTE allotted for this 920 households. The same 0.75 that is doing the calculations is not going to be able to go hit the pavement and go to all the civic organizations. So I will pull those resources from somewhere else. Obviously, I have to do it sooner than when the budget would even come into play. But it's not a neutral resource issue. There is going to be more person time required to implement these changes, as well as an IT system that can calculate the benefits based on the new alignment. So you have to adjust whatever the IT system is.
I think you have someone who'd like to support your point of view
Well,
right
I
here.
mean, I would just commend to our attention, right, the final pages of the report, which talks about the additional outreach expected. I mean, there are 3 dozen different organizations and events listed here, right? So that work alone is pretty significant. I think we've all sort of given a head nod to this idea that there are more folks who are eligible for this program who are not currently participating, and we'd like to see more outreach to them, so.
Additionally, even changes like adding retroactive relief, which requires an analysis and evaluation, right, of are those folks eligible under the criteria we've raised, and that, yeah, that what it could be marginal impact of, as you noted, those deductions, we'll see. But the disability income, the reevaluation of household income, I mean, they all sort of all together. Could it be 3/4 of an FTE? Who knows, but anyway,
There's
hard
also
to find a
data
3/4.
collection. Data collection code revision.
Okay, I don't know if any of my colleagues have any comments on this? No?
I think you're alone on an island here, Mr. Fazette. I think one FTE.
Not that we don't always want to ask county staff to do more work for less money, but.
Well,
No,
and I do, Mr. Vice.
Well, the only thing I certainly agree with Mr. Fazette that, and I know you will, Mr. Manager, look for economies and efficiencies throughout. So, hopefully you might be able to find some economies that will will allow us not to have that.
Alluded to actually just reprogramming within the DHS budget, looking for that within the existing budget is always an option that you explore. Other comments? So we're moving toward the end. We have the county manager's recommendations. There are a lot of things in here. And if we don't hear anything to the contrary, the presumption is that we as a body are comfortable moving forward, directing the manager to move forward with his recommendation to us, which is to begin implementation of the Phase 1 recommendations, and to, in fact, begin implementing the program in January of 19. Is that right? As proposed by essentially a hybrid of the working group and the staff. There was great similarity. I mean, there were just a few instances where the staff recommendations were slightly different. Anything else to talk about? Would anyone like to highlight anything from the 3 to 5 year period that they feel especially strongly about or anything like that?
Do.
Yes.
That's exactly what I'd like to do.
That was the only last thing I wanted to ask about.
Recommendation 20, ways to age in the community. There's a little bit of discussion about this, but I think this is so valuable and so important to us to think about in context of our sector planning exercises, ongoing conversations with CPHE.
Tell us what it is.
So it's explore ways to enable older residents to age in the community in affordable multi-age, multi-unit developments, as well as assisted living facilities with accessibility and supportive services. I am new to this term, age in the community, instead of age in place, and I think there's a lot that's really important communicated there, that not everyone is going to make their last home in the community the home they've been in for 30 years. And, you know, I would just add to, in addition to sort of some of the models or ideas here, you know, which we're including co-location, for example, with public facilities, just really wanted to highlight the idea of, you know, we've talked to some extent about missing middle housing form in single-family neighborhoods. I know that's work that CPHD has going on, and around the country we're starting to see those kind of small cottage models or stacked flats as really attractive opportunities for older residents, and to have that in Arlington would require code change. I know there's a lot of interest in looking at this in context of Lee Highway that Mr. Holland is probably aware of as well, wearing a different hat. And so I think this is just a really excellent recommendation for us to be sure to carry forward in our other planning efforts.
Very good. Good point. Okay. Hearing nothing else, I will just add my thanks to those from everyone else. For those of you that are still with us from the working group, thank you very much for all the work. When you hear the chairman of the group say, and he's been involved in a lot of different advisory groups and committees, that this was the best run and the most functional, and I think you got into some really interesting and complicated policy questions. So thank you very much. We're glad to be essentially adopting pretty much what you put forward, and we'll see how that plays out. And I certainly want to track it and manage it well. So again, thanks to all. We are adjourned. We'll be back in a half an hour for another work session. Is it a half an hour? Half an hour for another work session.